leave my house in a condition where it deteriorates. When housing deteriorates in the community, you have all kinds of problems. Lead paint, we know. You have asbestos. You have other kind of contaminants. People inhale that. People digest that. And so you create a community where a vacant house or a substandard house impacts health. If it's going to impact health, it's going to impact education. Wow, if I'm not able to have an adequate place to live, I'm not going to have an adequate place where I can eat or feel safe or secure, it impacts everything. And so we really have to find ways, I think, to level the playing field. We have to find ways in which we create value in communities that seem to be communities that are depressed or underserved and under-resourced. And I think we can do it. This is America. You think about the story of America, it has always been the story of people pressing forward, priests being innovative, priests looking for ways to make value out of those things that seem to be valueless.
Good evening. My name is Mike Haney, and welcome to Black USA on the Black USA News Network. And I'm glad you were able to join us today. Any questions that you may have for our guests or for me, just put them in the chat. And I'd like to bring on a distinguished gentleman, Dr. Al Hathaway, who's going to be part of our conversation. Mayor Rennie Langford's running a bit in terms of his technology, but I expect that he'll join us soon. But Dr. Hathaway, welcome.
Hello, Mike. How you doing? So glad
I'm
to be a
doing
part of
fantastic,
this
man.
conversation today, man. When you think about you got behind you breaking news, there's always something going on in America that we need to discuss.
Hey, no doubt about it. In our communities, man, sometimes it seems to be on a treadmill in terms of the breaking news and what's continually happening. That was a real compelling piece that I just played that you spoke to in terms of some of the disparity and economic issues in our community. Can you having trouble hearing me? Can you hear me now, Dr. Hathaway?
Well, Mike, can you hear me? I couldn't hear you as you was giving that little monologue.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear now, but I'm going to go ahead and let you, because what I want to do is give the viewers an opportunity to hear from you in terms of who you
Mike,
are.
I can't. Wow, Mike, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Hey, Dr. Hathaway.
Yeah, Mike, when you gave that monologue, I couldn't hear. But what I will say, because I know you have our audience here, is that I've been embedded in the community economic development field for more than 30 years. In fact, about 40 years. And some of the things that I've learned is that that the nature of economics, though it is macro, it really is micro. It is really what's happening within local communities and neighborhoods, where investment is being made, where investment is not being made, where valuation appreciates or where valuation depreciates. And I think that one of the challenges in Black America is that in many of the areas where persons of color live, whether it's Hispanic, whether it's Latino, whether it's African American, you find that they tend to be areas that are depreciating versus appreciating. Just think about it. You make an investment in a community. You maybe want to buy a piece of property, but to find that that property decreases in value instead of increases in value means that you have a loss in net worth. And that's some of the challenges that's happening all across the country and particularly in urban communities.
Dr. Hathaway, can you hear me okay now? Can you hear me a little better now? Let's see what's going on with this.
Unfortunately, Mike, I do see your lips move, but I don't hear what you're saying. But let me just keep on. Right now, just give me an example. Right now in Congress, they're talking about the infrastructure bill. And in that infrastructure bill, they have a human infrastructure that they're calling it, and then they have a physical infrastructure. Embedded in that is a conversation that's going to be very significant to people in urban communities. They want to have a temporary increase in valuation of historic think about the niche of that, the smallness of that. But just imagine to go from a 20% valuation to a 30% valuation. If you have a project that could qualify for $10 million in tax credit, that's an additional $1 million in equity that you can get into your project. Decisions that are made in the legislative area, particularly around economics, creates wealth. And many times we do not focus our attention on what's happening in legislature, federal legislature, state legislature, or even city legislature, as it impacts economics. And I think that that's one of the challenges of this era, is that we make certain that we keep our eye on the ball. Yes, we do have issues around voting rights. We do have issues around police and police relations and police brutality. But we must always keep our eye on the prize, and that is, how do we utilize economics and legislation to create wealth within our communities?
Great. Hey, can you hear me now? You still can't hear me. And I'm wondering if our viewers can hear me. If someone of our viewers can make sure that they hear both I and Dr. Hathaway and put something in the chat and say you can hear us, make sure that our technical difficulties are over. Can someone put in the chat that you can hear us?
Well, Mike, I'm at a disadvantage because I hear you. I see you talking, but I don't hear you.
So Dr. Hathaway,
I hope we don't have a monologue and have real dialogue.
Yeah, they're saying that they can hear me. So let you dial back out. You dial out. Dr. Hathaway, how about that? You still can't hear me?
Yeah, Mike. I find myself at a point where I don't hear you, so I just keep trying to make some presentations that I know that we wanted to share. Let me just give you an example around a simple thing like HUD. Now, HUD in most urban communities is the largest owner of substandard property, public housing, scattered site housing, elderly and high rises, and etc. And HUD is trying to reimagine itself and trying to re-envision itself as it seeks to take property that has had deferred maintenance over long periods of time, has been a bane in terms of many communities, been a drag in terms of investment evaluation, and they're now trying to improve that property. For example, in Baltimore City, they created a program called RAD program, where they would take the public housing, give that public housing basically to for-profit developers, allow them to leverage the rental income from that so that they can make investment back into that property to improve the property and the conditions. The landlords, the developers end up with an ownership stake. They end up with rental income, and they end up with an asset that goes onto their books. But what happens to the people that actually live inside of the public housing? One might say, well, they get an improved housing situation. But the reality is that the government and the private sector has basically used their voucher as a ATM. They basically are using them to increase their bottom line, but at the same token, the people that are investing in through their vouchers, government funding, is not getting any impact on their bottom line, any impact in terms of their asset. So HUD created a program to address that that's little used. Just think that there in 1968, you have the Housing Act of 1968, and embedded in that is a section called Section 3. And that Section 3 basically says that if you are a resident of public housing, or you live in a community that is impacted by public housing, you get preference in terms of business. If you start a small business, you want to be a management entity, you want to be a commercial construction entity, you have first preference for any funding that comes from HUD. But the challenge that we have is that all across America, that section is not enforced. It was intended to be a equalizer around income. We have an equalizer in terms of minority business, that's around race. We have an equalizer in terms of women business enterprises, that's around gender. But here you have an equalizer around income that is not being fully enforced in America. And I believe that we are missing the point. We're missing the boat as it relates to how do we lift people from poverty to prosperity. One of the things that I argue for and advocate for is the enforcement of Section 3 of the 1968 Housing Act to ensure that any funding that comes out of HUD, people who are most affected have the opportunity to participate in the business opportunities that are generated.
And you probably still can't hear me, Doc. Doc, can you hear me? Yeah, while Doc Hathaway works out his technical difficulties, I'm going to add former Mayor Lorenzo Langford to our stream and begin conversation with Mayor Langford while we work out the technical difficulties with Dr. Hathaway. So, Dr. Hathaway, if you can hear me, try to go out and then come back in so that we can work out your mic issues. Mayor Langford, can you hear me okay? I see your mic's not on. Can you hear me okay, Mayor Langford? Yeah, we can't hear you. So there's an issue with your mic. And of all the days, hold on a second. Let me unmute you. Can you hear me now? Yeah, we still can't hear you, Mayor Langford. Mayor Langford, try to go in and come back. Now we can hear you fantastically. Okay. All right. And while Mayor Langford, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to work through an issue with Dr. Hathaway. If you do us a favor and introduce yourself to our viewers, we got a multitude of viewers out here and having some technical difficulties. So if you could take a few minutes and tell people who you are and what you're about and where your life is taking you, I'll be back to you as soon as I get Dr. Hathaway straight so we can have a good conversation.
Certainly. First of all, let me say thank you for extending the opportunity to me to join this broadcast. Very quickly, my name is Lorenzo Langford. I'm a former mayor of the city of Atlantic City and the second African American to hold that position. I'm a native of Atlantic City, graduated through the Atlantic City public school system, went on to matriculate at North Carolina Central University, where I received a degree, a BS degree in business administration. Came back to Atlantic City and pursued a career in the casino industry, first as a dealer, croupier, a floor supervisor, and ultimately a pit manager before retiring from that industry and getting involved in government. I ran for city council, was elected 3 times to city council, and ran for mayor. And on the third try, I was successful in garnering that position. I held that position for 2.5 terms, total of 9.5 years, and have been retired since 2016.
Mayor Langford, thank you so much. So you were the second African American mayor in Atlantic City. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So tell me about the first one that you followed, and how you got to be the second mayor, Black mayor in Atlantic City. Who was the first one?
Okay, Atlantic City's first African American mayor was a gentleman by the name of James L. Ushry. He was an educator, a very erudite individual, community father figure, who made the transition from education to the world of politics. In 1982, he started that trek and was successfully elected in 1984. He held that position for 6 years until, unfortunately, he was swept up in a coup, a planned coup, to rid Atlantic City of its mayor, in a sting investigation called Operation ComServe. To this day, I maintain his innocence, and there's a lesson to be learned there. Maybe this broadcast will allow us time to delve into that a little bit. But at any rate, he was an assistant superintendent of schools, a graduate from Lincoln University, just a very, very, very dynamic individual who was much beloved by 3 generations in the city of Atlantic City.
And so you said that he was kicked out of office because of some sort of
an undercover
scandal?
Yeah, there was an undercover sting operation orchestrated by the New Jersey State Police called Operation ComServe. ComServe was an acronym which stood for community service. Mayor Ushry was in the hospital recovering from shoulder surgery when he was visited by a undercover operative who implored upon him that he wanted to do something for the kids. Came back the next day, brought the mayor a dinner, and then left a bag saying that this was something for the kids. When the mayor opened the bag, there was $6,000 in the bag, and next thing you know, he's charged with all kinds of felony charges. And the bottom line was they offered him a plea deal, and he accepted the plea deal. And at 67 years old at the time, with his pension from the educational system weighing in the balance, he took the plea deal, which was to simply vacate the office, pay a $1,000 fine, and have to perform 500 hours of community service, versus rolling the dice and taking a chance that he might get hit with a guilty plea, a guilty charge, I'm sorry, and then have to face 30 years in prison.
So did not make you apprehensive to run for office, particularly if it seemed to be some sort of sting? Is that something that Black political officials have to worry about, stings such as that?
Oh, absolutely. But it didn't deter me at all. As a matter of fact, it motivated me because I'm from a different generation than Mayor Usry, and he's from the generation where can't we all just get along, turn the other cheek, trust everybody. I'm the opposite. I'm very suspicious of people, who just show up out of nowhere, out of the blue. Beware strangers bearing gifts. I guess I could use that term. And so that motivated me because he was naive, very nice guy, very educated, but not too streetwise. And so they were able to ensnare him in that trap and get him out of office.
So let's talk about your term when you were mayor. You were mayor. You were elected mayor once, and you took over the remaining term once, I believe.
No, I was elected mayor in my first term started January 1st, 2002. And I served 4 years. I was unseated. The gentleman who unseated me was 2.5 years into his term, and he ran afoul of the law and was forced to resign. I ran for the remainder of his unexpired term and was successful. And then after completing his unexpired term, ran again for another full 4-year term and was elected. So I served a total of 9.5 years as mayor, 2.5 terms.
So what were some of the highlights of your term as mayor of Atlantic City? Because Atlantic City is what I consider the jewel of New Jersey. It's not big in landmass, 40,000 residents, but in terms of everyone knowing someplace in New Jersey, everyone's heard of Atlantic City. And be it because of the casino or beaches, everyone's heard it. So you, in fact, ran the crown jewel of the state. So what were some of your highlights of running Atlantic City, and what were some of your challenges?
Well, I made a campaign pledge to return the city to its people, and we were very successful in being able to do that. All of the key positions, from the business administrator to the 8 department directors to the 3 municipal judges, the prosecutor, the public defender, all represented homegrown Atlantic City products, most of whom overwhelmingly were people of color. So that was the major accomplishment. In addition to that, there was a group, and you're probably familiar with them. They're based in Baltimore, who came to Atlantic City and developed something called The Walk, a retail commercial establishment comprised of 83 stores. And it is and has remained the crown jewel in Atlantic City. We needed to diversify the product in Atlantic City and do something other than just gaming. And so shopping and dining was a major component. And I'm talking about David Cordish and the Cordish Company. They initially came to town from Baltimore and developed that project, and I was very instrumental. I created the pilot program. Pilot is an acronym that stands for Payment in Lieu of Taxes. I created the pilot program that enabled that project to come to fruition. It was started by my predecessor, and it hit a snag and was going nowhere fast. I was elected, came in, figured out the math and the numbers, crunched the numbers, made it work, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Hey, so Mayor Langford, when you ran as a Black politician, right, and you appealed to the people, you said the majority in that city at that time were Black. Is that true statement?
Yeah, it was about 50% African American, a significant Hispanic population, and the rest basically the white population.
Great. So let me ask you, so when we elect in our community Black elected officials, should there be an expectancy that there's some sort of Black agenda? You know, for so many years, we have campaigned on the thought that we needed more people, more Black people involved in politics to change the system. And I've got a follow-up question to that. So should Blacks, when they elect a Black official that runs on a Black platform of change and equality, should we have an expectation?
Absolutely, but those expectations should be realistic. For me, I always wear and have worn my Afrocentricity on my sleeve. I'm pro-Black. That doesn't mean that I'm anti-white, but I reserve the right to look out for Atlantic City residents first and to make sure that African Americans in this community, since we are the predominant ethnic group, that we're well represented in all facets of government.
So, Doc, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you.
That is
Mayor Langford,
fantastic,
how you
man.
doing?
I'm doing fine,
Technology
Doc.
has saved the day. So,
Yep,
so,
yep.
so, Doc, meet Mayor Langford. Mayor Langford, meet Dr. Reverend Hathaway. And technology has ruled the day. Dr. Hathaway, we were talking about Black
Hello.
agendas.
Wow, just as soon as that. Okay.
Yeah, we're talking about Black agendas and Black politicians and whether the Black constituency should have an expectation that if they elect a leader that ran on change and equality, that our agenda moves forward. What are your thoughts about that?
Just as soon as that happened, I lost sound. I lost sound for some reason. I don't know what happened.
You didn't hear us?
Can y'all hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
I can't hear y'all.
We're going to let him come back in and come back out. So Mayor Langford, the reason that I asked the question is because many times when we elect Black officials, councilmen, mayors that run on agenda of change, and I agree with you, it's not a matter of not including everyone, but you know, we are a people, a community that has been left behind educationally, economically, and disproportionately in law and justice. There's a bit of inequality. And in many instances, and it's not necessarily a perception, when we elect Black leaders, they seem to forget, you know, that there are things that need to be done in the Black community. And what they try to do is that they try to appease everyone. And then at the end of the day, they appease no one. Do you see that, or did you ever hear that complaint in Atlantic City as well?
That was a common thread through political reigns in Atlantic City prior to me ascending to the mayor's position, yes.
Great. Is there an example? I think that you had mentioned even with the first mayor, there was an issue that you ran into relative to funding for businesses in Atlantic City. And
yes,
that there was...
Yeah, I had an organization, a corporation that we had formed called Oasis Incorporated, and we had acquired a property, renovated that property, and opened up an athletic footwear and apparel store. And at the time, Mayor Ushery had a minority business loan program, and there were a number of residents who were seeking to own their own business who had applied for a loan, as we did. But there also were, you know, people from the white community who had applied for loans too. The restrictions that were placed and the impediments that were placed on us were much more stringent than the rules that applied to the white prospective business people who were seeking a loan. And I found that, it was a matter of consternation because, you know, I couldn't understand why the rules would be so different, particularly with African-American mayor at the helm. Fortunately, we were able to circumvent and get over that hurdle. And we did ultimately receive the loan and were successful in opening the business.
So it's not something unusual that we see with Black elected officials that somehow, is it because they feel as though they don't necessarily have the power, or they feel as though that they will be seen as too lenient towards Black? Why do we seem to have that all over the country? What's the issue?
I can't speak from the mind of other people, but I can only speak from my own perspective. I don't understand that mentality. And certainly, I was the reverse of that situation. And let me give an example. When I first was elected to city council, I was appointed to the Revenue and Finance Committee. And we were at a committee meeting, and we were discussing legal contracts, outside legal contracts. And there was about $3 million on the table, divided amongst 11 law firms. At the time, Atlantic City was about 52% African-American population, and 5 out of 9 council members were African-American. And of the 11 contracts that were being proposed, there was not one contract that represented an African-American law firm. I went to war over that issue, convinced my colleagues on council to support me, and they did. And we were able to change that paradigm.
Mayor Langford, Doc, can you hear us now? Doc? I think Doc Hathaway is still having issues, so we're going to remove him and have him come back in. So Mayor Langford, so is it because of special interests and the fact that many of the campaigns, and this is just ask Mayor Langford, former politician, his opinion coming regarding campaign financing. In many large municipalities, take for instance, Baltimore or Chicago, many of the elected officials are funded by big donors. And many times the donors don't necessarily come from the community. So is it that when we get into office, your opinion only, that we feel compelled to deal with the issues of special interest versus the issues of community, even though we ran on a platform of community?
I would suspect that that plays a major role in the decisions of some elected officials. But again, I don't know with any degree of certainty. I can only speak from my own experience.
Got you. So you had a national profile for a while, or for a certain period relative to Hurricane Sandy, I think, and a very I don't know if you can call him popular Governor Chris Christie, and he seemed to call you out, right, about your handling and managing Atlantic City. Can you tell us a bit about that? And was that a party-related issue, a color-related issue? Because it gained a lot of national news. You were on CNN, you were on the Today Show, and so Mayor Christie seemed to have a major issue with you and how you ran Atlantic City. Tell us a bit about what happened there.
I think it was part political and part racist at the same time. I harken back to, I believe it was the early 80s on a national presidential campaign where Michael Dukakis was the Democratic nominee for president. And the National Republican Committee, when they found themselves some 10 points behind in the polls, constructed and released a commercial, and I believe the gentleman's name was Willie Horton, where Michael Dukakis, as governor, had released this person who had been incarcerated, only to have this guy Horton, I believe his name was, commit another crime. And they used that to incite fear in the minds of white voters. And again, it was racist at its core. And it's been a play out of the Republican playbook to sort of demonize African Americans and play on the fear of whites. And so part of that, I think, played into the dynamic between Governor Christie and I. But more importantly, as I said then, and I've said ever since, he just decided to lie. He had given a directive for all mayors along shore communities to evacuate as much as we could. And I'm proud to say that of all the coastal communities up and down the coastline of New Jersey, Atlantic City had the highest evacuation rate during Hurricane Sandy, but you wouldn't know that listening to Governor Christie. So what happened was he went on national television, said that I defied his order to evacuate the city. I then turned to the media and said, don't take my word for it, check the record. We called 2 press conferences and admonished the residents to get out if they could. But in life, sometimes the best laid plans of mice and men go awry. And so as much as you plan, you're always going to have to deal with and prepare for a contingent. And so it's better to have a backup plan and not need it than to need it and not have it. And so we had a contingency plan because we knew some people, no matter what, No matter how much we admonished them to try and get out of town, that they would lag behind. And then when it was too late, want somebody to come and rescue them. So we opened up a community center for that population that didn't heed the message initially and originally. And so and it was a good thing that we did, because we had about 30 residents who we had to rescue and take to this shelter of last resorts. Someone had given the governor information that we had told the residents that they didn't have to leave, and nothing could be further from the truth. And
Wow.
and I will say this: after I brought that to the governor's attention, he never had the integrity to come back and just admit that he had made a mistake. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, and charged it to misinformation. But then after providing him with copies of the local regional news, where we had not one but two press conferences admonishing people to leave, when he refused to go back and make the correction on the record, then I could only deduce that it was deliberate.
Wow. So President Obama, during that same time period, visited Atlantic. Well, not necessarily. I don't know if he visited Atlantic City, but he
No,
visited New Jersey, and he
yeah.
visited Christie regarding the hurricane. What was that about with President Obama?
The White House had called. As a matter of fact, I had spoken with President Obama the day before his visit, and they were supposed to visit Atlantic City, because Atlantic City is the urban hub of Atlantic County. There are 23 municipalities in the county. 21 of them are Republican based and 2 of them are Democratic based. And Atlantic City is the goose that laid the golden egg, so to speak, economically. The straw that stirs the proverbial drink. And so that was President Obama's political base in Atlantic County. And it was also the epicenter of the storm. You'll recall that national news kept saying that it was going to hit Atlantic City, and that Atlantic City would be the most severely affected and suffer the most devastation. So the president said he was coming to Atlantic City. During the night, sometime during the night, the governor convinced the president not to come to Atlantic City, but to go to a nearby suburb right across the bridge from Atlantic City, a rather affluent community called Brigantine, Republican-based. And the president obliged the governor in doing that. Part of it from Governor Christie was to thumb me in the eye. But I understood what Obama was trying to do. We were 3 days from a national presidential election. He really had nothing to gain from coming to Atlantic City, because we were going to vote for him anyway. But I guess in his mind, he thought that he might get some leverage out of showing himself to be magnanimous, going to a Republican stronghold versus a Democratic base. That's just my thought.
Wow. Well, I appreciate that. You know, you're listening to 60 Minutes in Black USA. We're almost halfway through our show, and we will extend this show. Doc Hathaway, can you hear us yet?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, yes, sir. We're going to extend the show.
A scene that we all remember well.
Yeah, thank you, Doc Hathaway. Let me just get this infomercial out, because we're going to extend this show by 10 minutes so that we can really get the crux of what conversation collaboratively would have been. You're listening to 60 Minutes on Black USA. My name is Mike Haney, and Black USA is a media product nationally that was the brainchild of our founder, Donnie Glover. Donnie Glover's vision is to have a communications vehicle on a national basis that has credibility and information that we as a community can share in all regards. Black USA now is offered 7 days a week. We have broadcasts 7 days a week, and we're looking for sports broadcasts, arts and entertainment, religious broadcasts. We're looking for cooking shows. So if you have expertise and interest in that direction, please email Donnie or myself so that Donnie can evaluate and have conversation that we could potentially get you on the show. On Mondays through Fridays, Donnie hosts Black USA News from 10 to 11 each and every day. On Monday evenings, Sacred Shared Spaces with Quita, Chat, and Tayson. Tuesday night at 7, Donnie Glover Show. On Wednesday, Sister Biz with Nicole and Tamara, a phenomenal show for you ladies out there that want to hear some things about the Black female gender and what we're doing. Tamara and Nicole are phenomenal with that show. And on Thursdays at 7, our most popular show Black Business Roundtable with Doug and Dr. Ashley from Oakland, California. At 7 o'clock on Fridays, Black Crypto News, talking about money with Kamal Hubbard. And on Saturday from New York, Tazmera, talking about events around entertainment in New York and Harlem. So check out Black USA News. So Mayor Langford, I want to cue something up so that we can kind of move our conversation into, now and what we can do now. Dr. Hathaway gave a phenomenal overview from his perspective of things that are necessary in our community. But I want to cue something up from an interview that you did a bit ago, if you all can just bear with me.
I think the Million Man March was profoundly successful. The sense of brotherhood and camaraderie that was developed as a result of that march, and the call to personal responsibility for Black men across the nation was seen in a tangible way for weeks and months after the march. So it definitely was effectual and something that was historical.
Dr. Hathaway.
Yes.
Mayor Langford gave a compelling comments last year at the anniversary of the Million Man March. I think it was the 25th year anniversary of the Million Man March, talking about the uplift that it did, particularly in the African American community for men. Did you attend the Million Man March, or?
Unfortunately, I watched it on TV, and with great interest. Many of my friends and colleagues were there speaking. Many of my family was there, but specifically, no, I did not attend the Million Man March.
Well, could you talk to us a bit about your thoughts about us as men, Black men, taking responsibility and accountability in our community, and what some of the things that you feel that we can do here in the 21st century to continue to uplift our community? And are we accountable enough?
Well, I think one, I think we're finding that the demographics is showing that there is a decrease in two person families, the traditional family of a man and woman. I think that is something that we have to keep an eye on. I know when I was growing up, there were many households where there were men. They might not necessarily have been married, but they performed a role of stability within households. I think we have a real responsibility as men not to get caught up in the demographics and the statistics, but to do the job and responsibility that we have. I think we have a responsibility, one, to ensure that our children have a bright future. The second thing that we have is that we should ensure that our communities are protected and safe. And we also have to make certain that the significant others, those persons that we find integral and significant to our lives, also are fruitful and have opportunity for progress and success as well. There are many challenges to the African American male, high incidences of arrest and incarceration. When you find that, particularly in terms of males, that the African American female is the large dominant group that is graduating from colleges and universities. So when you find that African American males now, it's a different from when I was young to where it is now. Many have opted out, and I think we've got to find ways to bring the men back into their rightful position in our communities and neighborhoods and homes.
Mayor Langford, what kind of progress do you see that we're making as a community, and compared to when you made those comments a few months ago? You said in your comments that back then it was a galvanizing time and moment for Black men for a period of time. Has that continued, or do we need something else to galvanize us? How can you measure what we gained back there 25 years or 26 years ago to now? Where are we at from your perspective?
Well, in one way, I think we have regressed. A lot of the energy collectively as a community and a lot of the individual responsibility that we allowed ourselves to be held to um, is starting to erode. And perhaps we need another galvanizing event to remind us of what our goals and aspirations should be. And listen, when we first came back home to our respective locales from the Million Man March, everybody was fired up and energized. Even women in our community embraced the Million Man March. And as you know, there was a subsequent Million Women March. And there was an agenda that was set, not the least of which revolved around employment. And I personally saw a lot of local leaders, those who were in positions to create jobs or offer jobs, to extend their outreach and improve the unemployment prospects of that population that was unemployed in the city of Atlantic City. I saw men who heretofore were a little lax in handling their financial responsibilities with their offspring become more responsible. Unfortunately, when we look at the shootings that are taking place across Black America, and particularly in urban areas, the murders that are taking place, we're part of the Philadelphia region, and already they have experienced a 14% increase in the murder rate this year over last year, and it seems to be getting worse and not better. So there's a lot that we have to do. There are a lot of challenges before us, and perhaps we need another galvanizing event to put us back on course.
So the question is, and Dr. Hathaway, maybe you can answer this. We used to have Operation Push. We used to have the NAACP. We used to have a multitude of national organizations that seem to have agendas relative to us. Are we dissected so much as a community that we don't have the cohesion to have a base that will allow us to push things forward relative to education, as you mentioned earlier, Doc, and to Mayor Langford's point about economy and jobs? Are we missing a collaborative effort opportunity?
I think we are. I think part of our challenge is it revolves around the fact that when we think about the Big Six, those national civil rights organizations, they're starting to lose steam in this current generation, this millennial generation. They do not have the foothold that they had in the boomer generation, and as a result, you're finding multiple voices now. At one time, you would have religious leaders would lead in terms of voices. You had this emerging African American leadership group that was we get Earl Grays with the work of Black Enterprise leading in terms of direction. But now what you find is that we have leading voices coming out of the hip hop community, and they come to this experience with a different lens. And I think one of the conversations we need to have is how do we have the faith community, the political community, the hip hop community, and the business community really now begin to be in dialogue so that we have a common agenda. You start to see some leadership coming out of that community. I'm happy to see some of the things that they're doing, but in many ways, they are promulgating some of the lifestyles and some of the cultural issues that emphasize our deficits over against emphasizing our strengths.
So, Dr. Hathaway, you made a comment, and I have it flashed on the screen now. I was there when they were strategizing around the election of Black candidates citywide in 1968 and for Congress in 1970. Why at that time was it important, we felt, to have Black elected leaders?
I was really blessed. I was blessed that I grew up in Union Baptist Church, and there was an amazing array of African American leaders in Baltimore. They called them the Goon Squad. They made up people from academia, people from the Masonic Order, persons from the faith community and the business community. And they had a common era. One, they wanted to make certain that they got elected out of Baltimore, the first African American out of the 7th congressional district. That was very significant back then. That was Congressman Perrin Mitchell. And his organizer, his campaign manager, was a gentleman named Dr. Gustus Adair. Gus Adair was the faculty senate president at Morgan State University. So we had academia, we had the political community, we had the faith community, and the business community all lined around a goal, and that was to get an elected person to Congress. There was a gentleman, Sam Fidel, who was a Jewish gentleman. First time Fern ran in '68, didn't win, came back in 1970 and won. Then we launched Perrin Mitchell into the national arena, and Gus Adair then organized what we now know as the Congressional Black Caucus and became its first chair. So Baltimore kind of played a pivotal role in terms of a national agenda around organizing goals that we then adopted. Now what I find is that we don't have that kind of synergy in our political dynamic, that kind of synergy out of our political leadership, and that kind of cohesion with the faith community, with the business community, with the academic community that I saw in my youth.
Wow. So Mayor Langford alluded earlier in terms of the strife in urban environments relative to murders, we know, or crime, and then justice as well, not just the crime, but the justice piece as well. We know in many of these urban centers, there's a tie, and that's quantifiable, but we're not get into data today. We got into data a couple of weeks ago. It's quantifiable in Memphis, in Chicago, in Baltimore, and other urban centers in the country where there's high crime, economic issues relative to jobs, poor education. They're led in most part by African American leadership.
Yeah,
is it important based on that to have African American leadership with the premise that you all look to elect people back in the 70s and what's happening now, which is questionable? Is it important anymore to look to have African American leaders? I mean, what's the benefit of it that people should see?
Yeah, there is a benefit to have African American leadership, but we have to make certain that we don't lose sight of the prize. We place African American leaders in position. There was a gentleman, his name was Hakeem Mahbudi. Hakeem Mahbudi was formerly Don L. Lee. He gave this typology. He says that when you look at the political dynamic in the white community, the business leader is the leader, and the support systems are the faith community, the academia, and the political community. He then said that when you look at the typology inside of the African American community, you have the faith leader at that time as the leader, you have the political, you have the academic, and you have the business as the support. That has become inverted. Now we have the political leader as the leadership, and then you have the faith, the academia, and then you have business as a support. What happens is that in the dynamic of the political leader with the white community and the business leader, there is an imbalance. There is an inequity. And that essentially creates the problem that we have inside many of these urban communities, is that we aren't able to access capital. And capital creates jobs, and jobs have to flow in communities, and that's causing some of the disarray. I can give you an example. I'm a part of New Market Tax Credit, so I know the man knows that tool. I've been in that business now for almost 30 years. And we went into Sumter, South Carolina, and brought to Sumter, South Carolina, a Continental Tire factory. It was a multi-million-dollar investment. Prior to us going in, the average wages was $8 an hour. After we created that Sumter, South Carolina Continental Tire factory, that was 1 million square feet, created over 1,500 jobs, the starting salary was $15 an hour. We doubled the starting salary. So in these communities, if you look closely at all of these African American jurisdictions, you'll find that there is a disinvestment coming from basically the white community and the business community.
Wow. So Mayor Langford, your quote's up here. It says, the mayor's seat does not belong to anyone, including me. It belongs to the people. Every 4 years, a vacancy arises, and anyone has the right to apply for the position. So the people it belongs to, in certain communities, certain urban centers, there's a uproar that the seat belongs to special interests because that's where the money flows in order to back and pay for a candidate. True or not true?
Not true. I would dispute that accusation because ultimately it comes down to voting. And so, whichever candidate is able to convince the majority of people that he or she should be their representative has the upper hand. Special interests be damned. They can spend all the money that they want promoting a candidate or promoting a candidacy, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the people who vote.
So from a standpoint that's theoretical or that's a reality, because some people may challenge that thought. If it's theoretical, probably makes sense, it should be, but if it's a reality, say for instance, let's take Baltimore for example, a city that's 65% African American, that has a significant amount of African American women that vote, right? And yet we represent less than 30% of the minority business and contracts that are done in the city. And the reality that some people see is that special interests in terms of campaign contributions, etc., is what fuels and rules the day.
Well, I'll use my own situation and offer that as a critique. I unseated a 3-term incumbent. He was in office for 12 years. I was outspent 10-1, yet I won the election. Now, given that dynamic, I should not have won that election, having been outspent 10-1, going against a 3-term incumbent. Yet I prevailed because the people lifted me up and was the result of me ascending to the mayor's seat. It all came down to what the people wanted.
So you had addressed way back when in June 2010, you said that regarding crime and particularly murders, there was a couple that happened in Atlantic City. And of course, proportionally, Atlantic City isn't Philadelphia, Chicago, or even Baltimore. But you mentioned we can talk about addressing symptoms, but we need to stop causes. And it seems you're inferring that education or economy or jobs is a cause or the lack thereof. What are some of the causes that we have to affect in order to begin to improve? Because these communities seem to be similar, regardless of whether they're on the West Coast, Atlantic City, Baltimore, Birmingham, Memphis, Chicago. Most of our communities look similarly. But what are some of the causes that you see we need to affect?
Well, let me offer as an antidote. All urban areas, most urban areas, I should say, are plagued with gun violence. Now, I got into a spat with Governor Christie over a situation regarding crime. There was a murder in Atlantic City, and of course, he went on regional television and said that it was the mayor's fault. And I countered by saying, listen, the last time I checked, there are no gun manufacturing plants in Newark, Camden, Atlantic City, or any urban area throughout the state. So the real question is, what has he done to abate the problem of handguns coming into the city of Atlantic City and other urban areas across the state? Now, having said that, we got to be, again, realistic. Remember, I mentioned early on, it's about expectations. We can't expect governmental leaders and politicians to cure this by themselves. We treat the symptoms, but the root cause is beyond us. It starts with the family and the individual. I remember there was a protest, a group of citizens. There was a young 15-year-old who was murdered. And folk in that neighborhood decided to protest and storm the mayor's office. And I embraced them. And they basically, the mother, who was distraught, naturally, wanted to blame the council people and the mayor and the politicians for not doing enough, not offering recreational programs and other anecdotal kind of things that might curb the stem the tide of violence, right? But this murder happened at 4:45 in the morning. So what is a 15-year-old doing out in the street at 4:45 in the morning after having been hanging out all night? So I said to the mother, I pulled her aside. I said, you can point one finger at me, but the other three is pointing right back at your family. Like that 15-year-old Whose responsibility is it to make sure that he's not on the streets at that hour? It's not the mayor's. It's not the city council. When do we start taking personal responsibility for our own actions? Now,
That's real. That's real, Mayor Langford. You made another comment that said the reality is we've got to come together and police our own communities. I don't want to hear about snitching and not snitching when people's lives are at stake. There's a community issue, it's bigger than us. So it seems as though you feel as though we as a community have to take ownership of our own. But where does the leadership come from? Where does the leadership come from in these communities that's not political? We talked earlier, and I think Doc mentioned the Masonic Order and some of the other activist orders out there that seem to be in a bit of a flux. But where do we get the leadership? Because we're at a critical time, it seems, in many of our communities. Where does the leadership come from?
well, again, you have. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Doc.
Well, I think that leadership must be, all politics is local. We must recognize the value of what I would call primary, secondary, tertiary leaders. Primary leaders are those kind of leaders that have networks that are able to turn them out. In many instances, we have people that emerge as spokespersons, but if you ask them to, hey, can you get 100 people at a given time and given space, they can only get 10 people. And we want to lift them up as leaders. We've got to understand the organizational structure of our communities in such a way that we begin to lift up leaders that have followings and have followers. And those are the ones that we have to empower. In many instances, we don't.
Wow. Listen, I wish we could get into what is very controversial now, which is critical race theory, right? Critical race theory, and maybe you are familiar with that, and maybe you're not. But let me read something. Critical race theory is an academic concept that is more than 40 years old. The core idea is that race is a social construct and that racism is merely the product of individual biases or prejudice, but also something embedded in legal systems and policy. So as much as I agree with Mayor Langford that we do have to get our house in order and that there are certain things that we have to do within our communities and within our family structure, because it all starts at home, I believe, as Mayor Langford had mentioned as well. But when we get out into the world, does critical race theory take precedent in our legal system, in our justice system, and in our corporate world? What are your thoughts relative to critical race theory?
Well, I'll just say briefly that racism is real, but it has always been here, and our forefathers have had to deal with it in a much more overt way than we have. It's more covert now, but nonetheless, they've had to deal with it as we have to deal with it. But that, again, barriers are put in front of you, but you got to get across them. You got to get over them. You got to get around them. Some kind of way, you got to keep pressing towards the mark. So the fact that we are presented with additional challenges is not an excuse to sort of tuck and run. We have to face it head on and deal with it and move forward.
Dr. Hathaway,
Yeah.
Dr. Hathaway, let me ask you a question. You may, add to that. If you were mayor, because there was thoughts that people were thinking that at some point a couple of years ago you were going to run for mayor because you had, right? Am I right? People thought that you were going to run for mayor. You had a coalition of business. You're very well respected. But if you were mayor today, relative to economic and education issues in your city, in Baltimore, what would be some of your priorities to begin to change the tide and the dynamics of what we're experiencing?
Well, let me just say, the first thing that we have to attack is education. Our educational system is not as efficient and effective as it should be. I just want to say something about critical race theory. I come from Baltimore. Baltimore has had some amazing, outstanding leaders, one of which that I just lift up is Justice Thurgood Marshall. It would be mandatory reading. If I was mayor and I had the influence in the educational system, it would be mandatory reading that everyone read Justice Thurgood Marshall's dissent in the Bakke case. In that Bakke case, he begins to outline racism in America in its historical context and placed it as a legal construct. And one of the things that happened in this country, of the other countries around race, is that the white community made it a legal construct that race was embedded into our Constitution and into laws. And we've been fighting that legal construct over time. So now when the academic community wants to act as if this is some construct of it is white supremacy. And we've got to realize that as people of African descent, we have a rich history that really is before the Mayflower.
That's right.
And if we don't deal with the fact that our story begins before the Mayflower, then we will always operate in a position of deficit, because it then starts from the fact that that we were slaves, and we were not. We were people who were kings and queens and scientists and people of brilliance and excellence. They came from all over the world to Timbuktu to see how we were doing open heart surgery way back when. And I think that's the challenge that we have, is that white supremacy and these kinds that want to control a group of people are placing these theories and these ideas that really can be knocked out with anybody with any understanding of who we are and whose we are.
Mayor Hathaway, what would you do, Mayor? I'm sorry, Mayor Langford, go ahead. You got a comment?
We're fortunate that we have an African-American superintendent of schools, and the majority of the elected Board of Education are people of color. So there's no excuse for not having a curriculum that speaks to the kinds of issues that Dr. Hathaway just referred to. You know, we still pick up world history books, and I'll go back 50 years ago when I was in elementary school, and the first thing they talk about is the caveman, and they set the time around 2000 BC. And then it spent a page talking about that, and then they moved to chapter 2, and they talk about the Greeks and how the Greeks were off doing hieroglyphics, picture writing. They didn't even have a language, a formal language that allowed them to communicate. And then they spent a couple pages talking about the Roman Empire, and they spent 500 pages on the rest of the book talking about the last 2,000 years. But if they can go back 10,000 years and tell you about the caveman, and then come up to 2,000 years, there's an 8,000-year gap. Well, everything in that gap, that 8,000-year gap, related to people of color. So as Dr. Hathaway correctly pointed out, I think that's the point of embarkation, the launching pad. We have to start with our own history, which really is the world's history, you know, and talk about how it wasn't Europeans who civilized Africans, it was Africans who civilized Europeans.
Exactly.
So Mayor Langford, there's a black teacher in Texas right now that was suspended for doing exactly what you said within a class. This is part of the lawsuits that we're starting to see about the critical race theory and our bringing it into the education system, because whites are saying, and this is their argument, particularly in conservative jurisdictions, don't bring the problem that we're the bad guy. Let's all get along, etc., without us understanding our history. You know, Carter G. Woodson said the miseducation of the Negro, and he wasn't just referring to whites; he was referring to blacks miseducating ourselves. And is it as important to go to Harvard and Yale and come out with those ideologies and bring them into our community? Not that that's not necessarily good, but is that the best thing? Was his seemingly thought and theory about educating blacks to what you're saying, Mayor Langford, our rich history?
See, I'm not interested in his story, his in quotations, his story. We got to be interested in the story. And the truth is the light, and the truth shall set you free. So we got to be honest about history. We got to talk about where certain disciplines and sciences came from, you know, and most of them emanated from the African continent. We shouldn't be ashamed of that. We need to celebrate that. We need to tell it to the world.
I would agree. I mean, one of the things that we have, and this is what we have to recognize. Africa is the birthplace of civilization.
Absolutely.
All of our DNA comes from the African. And when you think about, the progress of civilization, people begin to move. People moved out of Africa, moved to other regions, other areas. And the nature of that culture and the nature of that environment is what created the changes inside of their DNA as response to environment. But all life, everyone, is originated and comes out of the blood, the birth of Africa. And the challenge is that if I adopt the idea of white supremacy, how then do I deal with the fact that in my DNA, I'm Black? That's the challenge. The challenge is to have people realize that we are truly all one, and that oneness is a person of color. That's the problem that I see in the world.
They tell us about the Middle Ages, often referred to as the Dark Ages, but they don't tell us why it's referred to as such.
Right.
They don't talk about the Crusades and how people from Northern Africa invaded Southern Europe and brought the knowledge and educated the Europeans.
Exactly.
They don't tell us why. They don't tell us that. I think we need to know.
Wow.
Yes, we do.
And in a situation where you have a board of education and a superintendent who happen to be people of color, then we shouldn't hide from that. We shouldn't retreat from that. We should be bold and assertive and just tell the truth.
Wow.
I was blessed.
You're listening to 60 Minutes. You're listening to 60 Minutes in Black USA. We are extended time today because of the technical difficulties that we've had. We've got 5 minutes left. Two wonderful guests, former Mayor Lorenzo Langford from Atlantic City and Dr. Reverend Alvin Hathaway, former pastor of Union Baptist Church in Baltimore and a community activist. Is that a good way to describe you, Doc?
Yeah. I'm still activated.
Well, hey, Doc, what is servant? You made a comment, that we are all servants. You said that, we owe a rent of service. What does that look like in our community? And how do we as a people embrace that so that to the point that we're responsible for our own progress, we begin to help each other a lot more than what we're seeing? How do we do that?
Yeah, that saying really came from Lily Mae Jackson, who was a leader inside of the NAACP movement, who challenged young people to realize that we had a responsibility to serve, and that service was the rent that we pay. And one of the challenges of this era is that we don't elevate service. That means participation in organized activities. We need to participate in the NAACP, the Urban League. We need to participate in those kinds of structures that seek to uplift people. I would say this. I remember we had a gentleman, Doc Cheatham, in Baltimore, who was head of NAACP. I would go out and buy 600 each year subscriptions to the children's NAACP magazine and give them to children in the schools, because I wanted them to get the monthly reader and begin to read about who they were. Those kind of literature is nowhere to be found. But I believe that service, and we've got to emphasize that. I went to South Korea. South Korea, there was 2 years requirement for youth to participate in public service. We need that kind of requirement here in America and in our communities.
Mayor Langford, what's in the future for you as we begin to close? What's in the future for you, Mayor Langford? It sounds like your passion tonight that you're not done. What's in your future?
Well, I am currently retired and happily retired. And my job right now is to just make myself available to the next generation. I'm here at their insistence or demand or just desire to get all the knowledge that they can from me and support them in any way that I can. And that's my role right now, to just advise and help the young folks, the generation that's coming behind me, to help them along and put them in a position to benefit from my sojourn.
I hear you. So you're in a mentoring position. Mayor Langford, we didn't talk about this, but I'm going to expose you, man. So Mayor Langford is a musician, accomplished singer. I have heard him. I'm not going to ask you to sing. Maybe I should, but I'm not going to ask you to sing
even
tonight.
Even if you did, it would be a flat out no.
I anticipated that. But a professional singer, professional voice, and I've heard you on numerous occasions, and you're wonderful, man. So there's a lot of other things you do and the talent that you have as well, but a phenomenal singer. So final thoughts from you, Mayor Langford, on our discussion tonight.
Well, let me just say it's been a pleasure to share this space with Dr. Hathaway at your invitation, Mike. And it's good to reconnect with you again. And we got to do better, man, and stay in touch.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hathaway, before you give your final thoughts, you can answer my question, man. If you were mayor of Baltimore, what would be a couple of things that you would do that are unique to what it is that we see happening now? Because at a point, people were thinking that you might throw your hat in the ring.
They did think that, but I would say if I was mayor, the one thing I would do with this American Rescue money, $640 million coming into Baltimore City, is that I would leverage that 10 times over. I just think to expend that money to not to leverage that resource, I think will be a tragic mistake that I hope that our city does not make.
So, Dr. Hathaway, you retired, I think, was it in June or July from Union Baptist?
Yeah, it was
as
August.
a
In August.
senior, in
Yes,
August,
yes, yes.
as a
And I'm gonna tell you
senior
one of the things
pastor.
that I did. I know we got short time. I went up and had a meeting with Phil Murphy, the governor of New Jersey. He's done
Okay.
some amazing things around the cannabis bill in terms of how to ensure that people who have been disinfected, been disenfranchised, are participating in this new business activity. And I wanted to learn from him, so I did. Mayor Langford, I want you to know that I went and met with him.
Okay.
Wow. Yeah,
He's
it's
a good man.
amazing that cannabis bill, they locked us up tenfold for selling marijuana on street corners. Now it's legal in shopping centers, and we got a insignificant piece of that in a multitude of jurisdictions. But, Dr. Hathaway and Mayor Langford, we're going to have you both back again, hopefully soon, because you guys have a lot to share. But Dr. Hathaway, any final thoughts from you, man? And
Yeah,
really
one of the things
appreciate
I
it.
want you to realize is that our strength has always been our moral compass. We always have to function with a sense of right and wrong. And we have to have a low tolerance for that which is right and a high acceptance of that which is wrong and a high acceptance for that which is right.
Thank you very much. You have been listening to Dr. Alvin Hathaway from Baltimore, Maryland, and former Mayor Lorenzo Langford from Atlantic City. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank both of you. And I'd also like to thank our viewers, particularly for their patience as we went through some technical difficulties. You're listening to 60 Minutes in Black USA. Thank you so much. Each of you have a phenomenal week, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week at 6 p.m.
Mayor Langford, Mike, best to y'all. Live life to its fullest.
Thank you.
Thank you.